Good evening, everybody. Hi, my name is Marie Dorini. I'm the Associate Director of the Columbia Institute for Ideas and Imagination, and it's wonderful to see so many of you here tonight. This is the last of our Entre, Nous series, a collaboration between the Columbia Global Centers, the Institute, and the American Library in Paris. And I'd like to take a moment to thank the teams at Reed Hall and at the library who've put so much time and effort into making this series such a lively and resounding success. Tonight, we're here for a conversation between Colm Tóibín and Anuk Arudpragasam. Colm and Anuk will read a bit, talk for about 45 minutes, and then they'll take questions. After the event, they will sign books, which are on sale at the back of the room from the wonderful Red Wheelbarrow bookstore. The conversation you're about to hear began some years ago in the Morningside Heights campus. Colm has been teaching at Columbia for many years, and Anuk was there earning a doctorate in philosophy. Once he completed his PhD, Anuk moved to Paris as a fellow here at our institute. One journalist reviewing his recent A Passage North began her article, in which she compares him to no other than Sebald, by calling him one of the most individual minds of his generation. And having spent several months in his company, I can confirm this. His extraordinary book was a finalist for the 2021 Mann Booker Prize and is currently a finalist for the Dylan Thomas Prize. His first book, Story of a Brief Marriage, was also shortlisted for the Dylan Thomas Prize and won the prize for South Asian literature. In writing about war-torn Sri Lanka, Anuk weaves together narration and meditations with a steady hand of disconcerting calm. It's tough to write a concise introduction about Colm Tóibín, so prolific is his output and wide-ranging are his interests. You've all read his essays about literature, gay lives, Ireland, family, illness, you name it, in the London Review of Books, the TLS, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, and more, where his poems also frequently appear. In addition to his novels, poems, and plays, Colm has also written two distinctive fictionalized lives of great literary men, The Master, about the last years of Henry James, and recently, The Magician, which spans the entire life of Thomas Mann. Colm is also a beloved professor at Columbia University in the English department, and I'll stop here. I won't go into the list of prizes and honors. Perhaps an efficient way of summarizing the effect he has on his students, his readers, and his audiences is enthusiasm by way of contagion from a great enthusiast, curious about everyone and everything. I should add that this is also a trait of Anuk's. Both are voracious readers, and it's as illuminating to hear them speak about their own work as it is to listen to them go on about literature. It's a great, great honor and pleasure to be with both of you tonight, and we're in for a treat. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is this working?
Yes.
This is working? Great. Anuk is going to read first.
Hi, everyone. Thank you, Marie, for that lovely introduction. I'm just going to read a couple of pages from the beginning of my book. Can everybody hear me? Okay. Here we go. The present, we assume, is eternally before us, one of the few things in life from which we cannot be parted. It overwhelms us in the painful first moments of entry into the world, when it is still too new to be managed or negotiated. Remains by our side during childhood and adolescence, in those years before the weight of memory and expectation. And so it is sad and a little unsettling to see that we become, as we grow older, much less capable of touching, grazing, or even glimpsing it. That the closest we seem to get to the present are those brief moments we stop to consider the spaces our bodies are occupying. The intimate warmth of the sheets in which we wake, the scratched surface of the window on a train taking us somewhere else. As if the only way we can hold time still is by trying physically to prevent the objects around us from moving. The present, we realize, eludes us more and more as the years go by, showing itself for fleeting moments before losing us in the world's incessant movement, fleeing the second we look away and leaving scarcely a trace of its passing. Or this, at least, is how it usually seems in retrospect, when in the next brief moment of consciousness, the next occasion we are able to hold things still, we realize how much time has passed since we were last aware of ourselves. when we realize how many days, weeks, and months have slipped by without our consent. Events take place, moods ebb and flow, people and situations come and go. But looking back during these rare junctions in which we are, for whatever reason, lifted up from the circular daydream of everyday life, we are slightly surprised to find ourselves in the places we are, as though we were absent while everything was happening, as though we were somewhere else during the time that is usually referred to as our life. Waking up each morning, we follow by circuitous routes the thread of habit, out of our homes, into the world, and back to our beds at night, move unseeingly through familiar paths, one day giving way to another and 1 week to the next, so that when in the midst of this daydream something happens and the thread is finally cut, when in a moment of strong desire or unexpected loss the rhythms of life are interrupted, we look around and are quietly surprised to see that the world is vaster than we thought, as if we'd been tricked or cheated out of all that time that in retrospect appears to have contained nothing of substance, no change and no duration, time that has come and gone but left us somehow untouched. Standing there before the window of his room, looking out through the dust-coated pane of glass at the empty lot next door, at the ground overrun by grasses and weeds, the empty bottles of Iraq scattered near the gate, it was this strange sense of being cast outside time that held Krishan still as he tried to make sense of the call he'd just received, the call that had put an end to all his plans for the evening, the call informing him that Rani, his grandmother's former caretaker, had died.
This is a short piece from towards the end of The Magician. Thomas Mann at this point is living in California. He's built a house in Pacific Palisades. It's 1942. He has managed to get his children, his 6 children, and his brother and his sister-in-law out of Europe to America. And his son Michael is a viola player, and he's involved with the string quartet. And Thomas Mann asks him if he will come to the house and play Beethoven's Opus 132. And this is just a small bit describing that. Thomas Mann's wife is called Katia, and his son is Michael. Yeah. When the music began, Thomas was struck by its daring, the quiet release of a sort of anguish, followed by a tone that suggested struggle, with hints that the struggle brought both pain and joy. He must, he knew, stop thinking, though, give up trying to find simple meaning in the music, but instead let it enter his spirit, listen to it as though he might never get another chance. It was hard not to look at the players, however, not to study their seriousness and concentration. Thomas watched them taking their cues from the lead violinist. The lead violinist and Michael on the viola seemed to spar, taking energy from each other. The music edged towards resolution and held back for a moment before it soared. He glanced over at Katia, who smiled at him. This was the world of her parents, who had hosted many such chamber concerts in their house in Munich. Out of this old world from which they had been forced to flee, Michael had emerged as the one with musical talent. Thomas watched him playing with slow care, showing no emotion, as handsome and self-possessed. He let the viola's dark sound hit against the sweeter sound of the 2 violins. As the music continued, the lead violinist and the cellist shed some of their Americanness. The rangy, friendly, masculine openness apparent earlier was replaced, he saw, by vulnerability, sensitivity, until they could have been Germans or Hungarians from decades before. Maybe he thought it was merely something he imagined, something caused by the force of the 4 instruments playing together, as they found moments of pure connection with each other, and then went silent or played solo. But Thomas could entertain the idea that ghosts from an earlier time, ghosts who had once walked the streets of the European cities carrying instruments, ghosts on their way to rehearsal, were present here in this house overlooking the Pacific Ocean in Southern California. Anuk, it's my job to ask the first question, so this is great. I want to ask you about a tension that's in your 2 novels, a battle going on between the private life and the public world, and where the introspection really, there's a sense that if the characters could only be left alone, the level of their introspection would be very rich, and the feeling that they don't want to be engaged in any way by what is happening. the ugliness that's happening, war, for example, terrorism, the feeling of belonging or not belonging. What they would really like is to be in love, or to be alone, or to be allowed to be fully introspective, to actually have a rich connection with their own inner selves, and that battle is going on in the two books. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, I mean, it struck me as a like an apt description of myself in a sense, and I think that's probably why. Yeah, so a lot of the things that happen in my novel, the characters are generally on their own. They're generally by themselves. I think when I was writing both of these novels for a long time in my life, I had the sense that you could, or the best way to get at the truth of a person, at the truth of an individual, was to observe them in moments where they believe themselves unobserved, to see how they hold themselves, what kind of mood they move with through the day, their posture, their gait. The moment when two people are talking to each other and they say bye and there's a smile, and then they part ways, there's always a moment when the smile fades, right? And I'm always interested in that moment, or what comes after it, or the transition between an outward-facing self and a kind of a self that believes it to be by itself. And I think for that reason, I guess I have felt like, so both of my novels are set around the civil war in Sri Lanka, and both of them kind of take war and its I guess psychological consequences, its traumas as kind of their main subject. But I guess with the characters themselves, I guess there's a sense that the world is not enough, or that the world these people are presented with does not allow them to have rich inner lives, or to have the thoughts or the desires, or to actualize the thoughts or the desires that they have, and that in some sense being alone, even though that is in some sense a more impoverished experience, can actually furnish them with things that they can't get in the world. I think with my second novel, it had to do a lot around the topic of mourning and grief, because in Sri Lanka, after the end of the civil war, in which tens of thousands of Tamils were killed, it was impossible to mourn or grieve the deaths of people in any kind of public way, because mourning, as we know, grief is a political phenomenon, and to mourn is to mourn the death of someone is to also to mourn the way in which they died, and the situations or the circumstances that made such deaths possible. So even today in Sri Lanka, we cannot mourn the deaths of the people who've died, and in public, that is. And so mourning too has to become a kind of interior phenomenon. So what are the ways in which the world can be pushed aside? What are the ways in which its interruptions can be assimilated, absorbed, and moved on from? I think these were kinds of the thoughts that kind of led me to have characters really in solitude for the entirety of these novels. I mean, it's interesting that you asked, because it's also something that comes up in both The Master and The Magician, specifically in the Magician, I think, because there's this constant tension between Thomas Mann's inner life and then the world outside him, right? And a world which I think he's very aware is not amenable to what he wants.
Yeah, that I was working with the idea of Thomas Mann as almost a ghost in his own life. You know, that it was all the noise in the book is made by other people, by his family, by his wife, by his children, his brother, and that he's always coming into a room as though, and no one pays any attention to him in his own household. And even when he's giving a lecture or in public, there's a sense that only a part of him has ever left the study. That the real person, if there is such a thing, is the person who's alone for 4 hours every morning in the study. But there's also the other question, which is that I think he was the least prepared figure for what he was going to have to face politically. And in other words, that he really wasn't political. And he'd be dragged into politics by circumstances. And that his response to part of the problem is that if you're trying to imagine the past, is that some of it seems easy now. it's easy, oddly, if you're writing a novel set in the 1920s and 30s in Germany, because after the empires and after the Austro-Hungarian, after the big empires, there was a vacuum, and in that vacuum, these strong men, these bullying figures could emerge. And of course, anyone like Thomas Mann was going to be deeply opposed by it and hurt by it. I can see that, I feel that, I know that, but I don't know 1914. I can't to feel what he felt in 1914, which was huge Prussian patriotism, militarism, wanting bloodshed, wanting Germany to win, feeling that France was the enemy, Russia was the enemy, England was the enemy. That level of emotion, which oddly enough was felt by Henry James in London in the same months on the other side. But obviously it was felt by many other people, but trying to find someone as rational and apolitical as Thomas Mann, having those feelings when the First World War broke out, really took a leap. I had to really work to make it credible in the book that someone as rational as he was, as sensible, as normal, could actually have those feelings, which we now believe to be ugly feelings. But he didn't feel them as ugly feelings. I mean, he didn't know there were ugly feelings in 1914, which is even stranger. So you're sort of working all the time with the idea that if he had been left alone, if everyone had just left him to 4 hours in the morning in his study, then he could have worried about being homosexual, or he could have worried about whether his book's good enough, or he could have had his own private griefs. But the public griefs came and took him over. So by the 1940s, he's touring America, making big speeches as a public figure. It's what Auden said about Yeats. That mad Ireland hurt you into poetry. And it was that mad Germany hurt him into speaking in public and being in public. So I think the same issues arise if you're writing a novel where you're trying to keep the private, the intimate going all the time. Because if you lose it, you give way to that you're merely writing a sort of political public novel. And that's really not what you're doing. And there's something else in the books I want to ask you about, which really relates to Ireland, which is that, Ireland is partitioned. So when the Troubles began in the North in the 70s, it was very hard to know how the Republic of Ireland would respond. For example, when Bloody Sunday happened, there was a big demonstration in Dublin which culminated in the burning of the British Embassy. That was January 72. That was the last public building burned in the Republic, that the two countries moved away from each other. The North continued for the next 25 years, and the South watched it. So if you wrote a novel in Ireland called A Passage North, it would really mean something that, that it would really be that somebody from this quiet little backwater island had moved into this conflagration. And I did get some of the same feelings that Colombo, or that the sense of, especially in The Passage North, well, actually in A Passage North only really, that the division between what's happening in the city and what's happening in the Northeast is really considerable, and it's on the protagonist's conscience, how little he knows about it, how much he cares about it, and the distance between those two things.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, the main character of A Passage North, Krishan, is like me in the sense that he grew up in Colombo during the war, was born into the war and left the country while the war was still going on. And in that sense, even though his family is from the North, even though his mother and father grew up there, it's a place that he's been cut off from because of military boundaries, because of the front lines of the war. So the North was always a place of imagination, a place where he'd hear stories about, where he'd read essays about, where he'd see footage from, but always a subject of the imagination, nothing concrete, even though these two locations are so close. In a way, people from Colombo have less access to Jaffna than they do to many places around the world during the war. That is, and even I remember noticing this when I went up to the North for the first time when I was 20 or 21. I remembered seeing young men, I mean, actually, in a funny way, look quite good, but they would all wear bell bottoms. This was in the early 2000s when nobody else wore bell bottoms. But they had been cut off from, I guess, fashion and pop culture and so on and so forth for so long. And there were all these habits of speech and these mannerisms that seem kind of outside. It seemed kind of outside time. And so for Krishan, the main character, a lot of his relationship to what happened in the north, where the war zone was located, was spectatorial. It was something that he had to observe. It was stories that he heard from people he knew, but never anything that he experienced himself. And so I think for the character in this book, there was this kind of, and it's something I wanted to ask you about your books, actually. There was this guilt from being a spectator and not being subject to violence himself. And I mean, it's interesting, both The Master and The Magician are kind of, they're both novels in the background of very serious, very heavy war, right? And in both cases, the protagonists are not individuals who see any action in war, or who are even subject to, I mean, I guess there weren't bombs per se in the American Civil War, in the sense that there are now, but there's this tension, I think, between what it means to be a spectator and what it means to actually participate, because a lot of these people would have known Thomas Mann and Henry James, would have known people who actually suffered, who actually lost limbs, or actually were bereaved in the war.
Yeah, I mean, people don't associate Henry James with war, but there's a moment in 1897 when the statue is being unveiled in the Boston Common to the 97th Regiment, the one that included African Americans, and William James is going. Sorry. Yeah, the Shaw Memorial. Yeah, the San Gaudens. Yeah, the San Gaudens Memorial to Colonel Shaw, and it's being unveiled by William James. And he writes to his brother to say he's unveiling it. And surely they must both have seen how strange that was, that neither of them joined, and neither of them fought in the war, but their two younger brothers did, and all their contemporaries did. So somehow or other, the two of them managed to get out of fighting. It's hard to imagine what Henry James would have looked like in uniform, or felt like, indeed, and it would have changed, I think, maybe the history of literature had he been involved. But so that I was able to write the scenes where his brother Wilkie, who was one of those younger brothers that everyone adored, and everyone wanted Wilkie in their game, and suddenly he comes back, and they cannot even move him from the lower floor of the house, and he's clearly really badly injured. And he's lucky to be alive. And then both brothers were destroyed in the war, younger brothers. And so Henry James's early stories, he apologizes in one of the stories, saying that this is the reverse side of the picture. This is the wives and sweethearts. This is not the battle. And so his whole life was lived in the shadow of this. That people like Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was a friend of his, all those people had fought in the war. And the same thing happens with Thomas Mann when he learns of the Holocaust and realizes he's actually married. The Katia's family is Jewish. They were assimilated Jews. And the whole idea of that having happened in his country, using his language, with people who were listening to the same music as he was listening to. I mean, that really worries him, that the same Wagner that moved him moved others into poison. And so, yes, there is always that idea of being away from the war, and that bringing not satisfaction or relief, but a sort of shame, a sort of worry that you behaved inauthentically at a really important moment. And that I think absolutely haunts both of them. The two books that I wrote, those two books, were so nourished by things I was teaching, things I was reading, that they really couldn't have been written unless I had written a lot of essays and done all that. And it struck me, even with The Story of a Brief Marriage, even though it's so visceral and physical, it's so much about the body in a short space of time, that it has to have been nourished by your by your study, some notion of what it means to be alive, and you distilled that, you brought it down to a very short period of time by people who were not themselves bookish, but you gave them a sense of life. What does it mean to be alive in the world, in time? And even that passage that you read there, it's the opening passage really, the book, which is about time. I just wondered to what extent your reading, your reading in philosophy has made a difference to the novels.
It's really difficult for me to say because I guess philosophical reading has been more part of my reading than the novel for most of my life. You're right. With the story of a brief marriage, there was this project also. This was a book that was written out of shame or written out of guilt, out of a sense that I should have been subject to this violence too, and to this inquiry into why I was not, or like what kind of luck or benefits or fortune or privilege shielded me from that experience. With that book, it is very intimate. There's a lot of bodily intimacy, really. There was a focus on walking, on sleeping, what it means to sleep in such a situation, what it means to touch another person in a context in which you have been totally alienated from your own body and other bodies by the sight of violence being so systematically pushed onto people or forced onto people. What it means to touch somebody in a gentle way or in a caressing way or in an erotic way, or what it means to speak a language in a context in which words have ceased to are no longer anchored to ordinary objects in the way they are in ordinary life. And I think in a way this was, it must have been informed by what I studied philosophically. For me, it was the body or the possession of a body was the only thing I had in common, and a language, with the people who went through this war, who experienced it firsthand. And so it was kind of, so this was kind of why I chose the body. And that book also was set over a very short period of time, like you say, less than a day. And there is this kind of, I have thought a lot about, I guess, time and the experience of time in relationship to such events. The opening passage of this book is also about time, and I think for me, for people who were not part of who were not directly involved in war in Sri Lanka, we only found out about the extent to which human life was lost, civilian life, innocent life was lost after the war was finished. The government didn't allow journalists or reporters in the war zone. So it was really people taking footage on cell phone cameras and things and uploading it to their relatives putting it on websites online. It was really through these kinds of means that we found out about what had happened. And it was generally like 6 months, a year after this genocide had taken place. So there was this sense, like they say the light you see from a distant star is many millions of years old. Watching this kind of footage or looking at these kinds of images was like watching something that had actually unfolded a long time ago, that had happened and that was over. That took place in a kind of different time, right? There were these different zones of time. These different experiences of time, and I think that I don't know if you thought. I'm curious about how you thought about time in relationship to your depiction of your subjects. Both of the books. There's very different approaches in a sense. Henry James is much more. I guess, would you say that the Henry James book is centered around the period of the Civil War?
No, that comes as flashback in the book. The book is structured around 5 years, I suppose 1895 to 1900. Yeah. And the reason is that in 1901 he begins his really heroic period, which is the Ambassadors, the Wings of the Dove, the Golden Bowl, written in a year each while he's alone in Lamb House. It's the culmination, in a way, of the 19th century novel, and it's a way out of the 19th century novel into another zone of fiction writing. And so I'm interested in the 5 years before this, when really he begins with the disaster in the theatre. The only successful work he does in this period is The Turn of the Screw, which arises from very particular biographical circumstances. He gets his first house, and while he's having it done up, he writes The Turn of the Screw In other words, it's about him going as the governess into a new house where he's going to be very frightened indeed. He's preparing himself in a way for this great solitude that he's going to experience in Rye, which he does experience. And with the Thomas Mann, I couldn't do that because I couldn't give things in flashback. That the novel had to move as his time in history moves. He didn't know the First World War was coming a month before it came. He didn't know the inflation was coming. He didn't know Hitler was coming. And that has to happen in real time in the book. If you bring it as flashback, when he knows everything and has experienced much, then you lose its immediacy and urgency and drama. So I had to use the system a biographer uses, or at least in sort of Anglo-Saxon or Germanic biographer uses, of chronological time. I hated doing it. I wanted to do anything but that, but nothing else would work. What I want to know about the story of a brief marriage is, I worked on those two books over a very, very long period of time. A lot of preparation. I knew I was doing them 15 years before I, finished them. So it was all that period of time. Often, I wrote beginnings way before I wrote the rest bit. But I have a feeling with the story of a brief marriage that it was written under very particular circumstances. I don't know what they were. But there's a sort of intensity in the book. There's a sort of ferocity in the way experience is dealt with, that it strikes me that it was written in exile. It strikes me it was written in New York. Not that there's anything of New York in the book, but I mean far away from home. Yeah. And could you just give us, because for anyone who's read the book, there's a very intense experience in reading it. And I think anyone who reads it will wonder what was it like when you were writing this book? Where were you? What else was going on?
I did write the book mainly in New York. Hopefully New York doesn't show up in the novel.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't. I promise you, it doesn't.
There are mistakes in the book that I like with geography, with particular things that I left intentionally so that there be some kind of trace of I guess the fact that this is an interpretive project, one that took place across quite a distance. But I started writing shortly after I started coming into contact with all this footage. I had been writing maybe seriously for a year before that, and I had no intention really of writing of war. But when this material, when I came into contact with it, I can't think of anything else that's happened in my life that has affected me more profoundly. I changed all manner of things, and it's actually related to something I wanted to ask you, but I had this very specific, this strange experience of, because I would watch this material every day. It was obsessive. And I think a lot of people do this. There's, all the wars that take place these days. There's footage. There's mazes and mazes of footage available, very, very violent and disturbing footage and images available online. I had this sense of my entire life, or so much of how I carried myself, becoming, feeling inappropriate, feeling suddenly... I use this analogy. I remember once I was in the subway in New York, and a person came by asking for money, who was a burn victim, and it was difficult to look at this person. And the carriage had been a normal carriage, like before this person had walked through. People were laughing, they were listening to music, dancing, they were complaining to their neighbor, they were gossiping, making jokes or whatever. And then for the period of time in which this person moved through the carriage, everybody averted their eyes. If someone was dancing to music, they stood still. If somebody was making a joke, they paused. There was a kind of silence as the person moved away. And then once they were out of the carriage, everything resumed as if nothing had happened. And what I took away from seeing this kind of phenomenon was that, it's a very obvious fact, but when there's certain things become inappropriate when you are in the presence of another person suffering. Certain kinds of lightheartedness, certain kinds of pettiness, certain kinds of desire even, suddenly seem out of place. But we know that even though the person has left the carriage, they still exist, and that actually nothing should change maybe in your comportment. If you were silent while the person was in front of you, perhaps you should remain silent. Or if you withheld certain forms of communication or lightheartedness, maybe you should continue to withhold those forms. And I felt that very strongly. For example, I would wear a lot of color before, and I stopped wearing color for a lot of years. Actually, this is a less colorful outfit than usual. I wear color again now. But I felt this strongly, and there were lots of things I kind of stopped doing for those 3 years, because it was difficult if you're writing for 4 hours in the morning or the afternoon and you're working in this world, and then you return to ordinary life. A lot of it doesn't seem correct, right? And I guess I was wondering also with Mann specifically, like what does the presence? I mean, because these people weren't unaware of. I mean, they were, in some cases, in James's case, was very close to this kind of suffering, right? Even if he didn't experience it firsthand. Do you feel like, how did it impinge on the tone or the mood of their writing? Did you feel like there's something you can sense?
Thomas Mann was already thinking about the Magic Mountain when the First World War broke out. And obviously it would have been a very different book if the war hadn't occurred or if he'd written it more quickly. And when the war broke out, he had no idea what to write. And he was so fired up because obviously his wife didn't agree with him. His brother, Heinrich, was almost a pacifist. And yet all around him was this sort of militarism. And so with a man called Ernest Bertram, who later on became a sort of Nazi intellectual, who was a great devotee of Nietzsche, with Bertram coming to the house every day, Katia really despised him, just didn't like him. Bertram was gay, but that, oddly enough, made no difference. It was his knowledge of Nietzsche that interested Mann. Mann didn't really know very much. He wasn't a scholar. Bertram was a scholar. And Mann wrote a most dreadful book in these 4 years called Reflections of a Non-Political Man. It is an ugly book about Germanness and being an artist, and he very cackles almost at the sinking of the Lusitania. Thomas Mann. And luckily, he was so lucky, it was published just as the war was ending, so no one noticed it. And it simply sank. It's recently been reissued by the New York Review of Books Classics, so it's sort of worth looking at to see how mad a great man can become under certain historical difficult circumstances. And when the war was over, he then went back to the Magic Mountain. And of course, the Magic Mountain was shame. It was he saw the sufferings of the troops coming back. He began to learn about the dead. He began to learn about the sheer foolishness of the German war aims. And very quickly, really, by the Munich Revolution certainly didn't help him, because he was seen as a great bourgeois. So they almost arrested him. Yeah. And then by the time 1921, 22, he is a completely new person. He has transformed himself. And he begins to write this great book, which is so filled with the arguments about where Europe should go. It's pre-war, so he's reimagining, refinding a time that was so lost to him and seemed so shameful to him that he wasn't thinking properly in 1912, 1913. And it also, of course, is it's a hymn to his wife, because she was the one who went to Davos. She was the one who had tuberculosis. She was the one he went to visit. And so, in fact, there's a sort of an erotic charge going on about his own marriage that's going on with Hans Castorp's visit to his cousin. So, there is a real sense that history changes him, and he comes, but he still doesn't. He then, of course, is too obtuse to notice Hitler. He's too involved with his books, his lecture tours. He's seeing a Germany that's still free and democratic, because they're his readers, without realizing actually what's coming. It's his children who see it much more clearly. So all the time there's this sense that if only history could leave him alone, he could get on with his erotic life or his, some other element in him. So the very last book he wrote at the very end of his life, when he was really put out of America with the Cold War and the McCarthy period, he came back to Switzerland in his late 70s, one more book to write, and he wrote Felix Cruel, which is a book about a chancer, a trickster, a confidence man, there's an element of autobiography in that book, that this is who he has been in a secretive way all his life. And so, I mean, there is, for example, in The Passage North, there really is that a great love, two great love stories, really. It's the protagonist and his grandmother, and it's the protagonist and his girlfriend. And there is a sense that actually that could be a novel on its own, if only history, war, could leave them alone. We were talking a few weeks ago, I was talking about Fabrice in the Charterhouse of Parma, being the template figure for this, where, he's on his horse, he's in love, he thinks about love all the time, he's a complete idiot, he thinks about love, and then he thinks about love. But he's riding his horse around an area that he later learns was called Waterloo. And the date is right, and there was a lot of noise. And he realizes, I think I was at the Battle of Waterloo. And you can see Stendhal having immense fun with the idea, I'm not going there. If you think I'm giving you the battle, no, because Fabrice is in love, I'm giving you love. And then you can see Tolstoy, you can see every novelist in a way having to grapple with these questions of whether the protagonist is in love or whether he's in history. So...
No, it's a really good way of putting it. I guess a lot of traditional depictions of love in literature would involve this hope or this ideal of transcending the ordinary or transcending time in some sense, right? The world outside falling away. With respect to Thomas Mann, it was so interesting reading the book, and because I didn't know anything about his biography, and I sensed that he was, in some sense, he had non-political tendencies, but from the kind of you had probably a range of choices for how to interpret his lack of, notwithstanding what he says himself explicitly about it, and my sense from reading was that there was a certain kind of timidity in Thomas Mann, a certain a certain kind of lack of conviction. You talk about how, so with Felix Krull, he's exploring this idea of a playful character, or this character in which there's some kind of constitutive irony between his outward appearance and what's going on inside of him. But the character of that book, from what I remember, played this role with conviction, which it doesn't seem like if Thomas Mann, if there was a distance between his outward persona and his inward persona, it wasn't instituted in an ironic fashion. I was curious, what interested you in dealing with a timid character in this case, a character who, Thomas Mann, he clearly was in some sense author of his own life, but there was this really striking scene at the end of your novel when Thomas's son Klaus passes away, and he's with a daughter Erika, and he's with his wife Katja, and they're waiting for Thomas to give instructions. How should we deal with this? Should we go to the funeral? Should you cancel your book tour? And he just doesn't give an answer. He just waits, and finally, not any of them, I think, makes it to the actual funeral. And it was really striking because, as you say, this was very clearly not the right thing to do, to avoid the funeral. And yet he kept repeating to himself or to the others, let someone else make a decision, let somebody else decide. And it struck me that this Thomas Mann of your book was is for all his power and all his prestige, a character very much lacking in a certain kind of agency, who's bound by fear. And it struck me also that that there was something that interested you in that approach to such situations.
Yeah, that I'm interested in the non-heroic, in someone who's at the edge, who didn't do, who almost did, who didn't have the conviction. because I think I can explore all those ambiguities much more than I can do if someone like Thomas Mann's brother, he's a socialist and then he's a socialist. He operates according to a set of principles. Thomas Mann doesn't have those principles. So then all sorts of shadows, mysteries and ambiguities arise. That scene is a particularly difficult one to write because Thomas Mann he was in Stockholm. He could easily have gone to his son's funeral. He was with his wife and his daughter. And his son had committed suicide in Cannes. And he just doesn't go. Why doesn't he go? There's no... I have to make it into, a very, very long scene going on over days where that decision is made because it's so hard. If he makes a quick decision, we're never going, I'm not thinking of going, then you fix him too clearly as a man who makes those sort of decisions. I can't fix him. I don't want to fix him. So therefore I have to make him just postpone and hand the power over to others and to move like that. But I think the novel itself as a form lends itself to the anti-heroic, not necessarily to the cowardly, because that's too fixed as well. But that I think it's important in A Passage North, isn't it? And it's important also, perhaps, in Story of a Brief Marriage, that your protagonists are not activists, that they're caught up in this, and that they would perhaps, that they're not involved like other cadres or comrades are. They hear in Journey North, Passage North, he hears the stories, but he isn't as though he's fired up and decides to join. He doesn't join. And in a way, that's what I'm talking about, that in a novel, you can get someone who doesn't join much more energy from that for a novel than someone who's committed to a cause.
Right.
Discuss.
Okay, Professor Tóibín.
Actually, maybe we should leave it. Maybe it's time. Is it time to go?
Do we have?
Do you want to answer? No, come on, answer the question. This is your oral.
Wait, what is the question again?
The question is that the novel form lends itself to the anti-heroic. That if you look, for example, at Conrad, even at the way in which the figures, even in the Secret Agent,
Yeah.
or that if you look at even Leopold Bloom in Ulysses, it's not as though they're active in any particular cause, including sometimes their own one. I mean, they're just their personal one.
Yeah.
That they're somehow or other moving in and out of commitment. But the commitment ends up being a commitment to the moment, or a way of evading responsibility. And it almost begins with the novel as a sort of that sort of 18th century picaresque form. We're back with Quixote. We're back with someone, wandering around aimlessly, wondering, what to do. And that actually is an energy that the novel can deal with much more than it can deal with the absolute committed anarchist, communist, or cadre or comrade.
Right. I mean, it's interesting when you read, like, say Homer, say the Iliad, another book about war, which is all action, right? There's really no room for hesitation, for ambivalence. Everything is spoken and everything is done. And yeah, I mean, the fact that the novel that there's space between event and response, there's space for thought, there's space for reflection, there's space for ambiguity and ambivalence. The fact that you don't need in a novel to say, to have your character, there are so many ways in which a character can also enlist for war, right? I mean, they can go with hesitation, they can go with fear, they can go because they don't want to be shamed, and not because they want the liberation of their country or cause or whatever. I mean, I think you're right. I think it's part of the novel form that there are these spaces, I mean, in action that could be read differently and they can have different meanings, and that we, as writers, we're free to kind of dwell in that space, and that dwelling in that space becomes a kind of, it becomes a way of reflecting on how we dwell in the world more generally, right? I mean, because there are so few moments in life in which we are actually called upon to act. I mean, with Thomas Mann, it happens very, very vividly and very immediately. But like, I mean, how many of us, how many bourgeois people, how many, that is to say, potential readers of the novel find themselves in situations where their relationship to their ideology or their professed convictions stands or falls on some dramatic act? Very few, right? They're very few. I mean, and so as a bourgeois also form, the novel really, allows that, gives space to that. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take questions or comments. Even we don't mind comments. Oh, great! We've got. Do you want a mic or do you want to shout?
I'll shout.
Oh, hold on. There's a mic.
I don't mind shouting. It was just to pick up that point you were making about Mann not being heroic, but then very shortly after the death of Klaus, he's approached by the Americans and told in no uncertain terms not to go to East Germany, and that if he goes to East Germany, he will not be welcome back in America. And he thinks, I'm not going to be told what to do by these people, even though he had his house in Pacific Palisades and a whole life there. And he knew what it would mean to go to East Germany, but he went. Yeah. That was his moment. But now how...
I have to be very careful with that because I keep wanting to make him indecisive and unheroic and watchful and careful, so that his motives for going in my version of the story, are that he doesn't want to be mocked by his brother Heinrich for being an American stooge, and he doesn't want Brecht bad-mouthing him for being someone who's just, they're pulling his strings. And therefore, it isn't out of conviction. I mean, he does say very beautifully that, he lives in language, and he lives in the German language, and the German language is not divided. But when he's questioned about this by someone from the CIA, really says to him, do you not know that your words on the other side, you can say what you like, but it will not be reported? There's not a free press. Are you sure? What are you thinking of to go in there? They'll use it for propaganda. But he does decide, yes, he does. It is a nice moment where he decides eventually, to hell with you, I'm going in. Yeah. And he does do that, and he does face the consequences of that.
Which I thought was quite a noble moment, given everything.
I mean, the problem with working with him is you have to follow the facts. And sometimes the facts are really uncomfortable. It would have made me much happier had he hung around the border for a while
and not gone
and just decided eventually to say, well, you decide, to his wife, And so, I mean, there were times like that where I really had to say, okay, take 3 or 4 days just going for long walks, thinking, how can I give him another motive other than a good, pure one? So that was a big dilemma.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I found myself thinking while you were talking that if your subject had been a woman, would you have found indecision to be a storyline?
Would we have what?
Found the indecision to have been interesting. Because in general, women portrayed fictionally or in novels are heroic, right? There has to be, women are assumed to be not in a position necessarily to, not always, I grant you, Mrs. Dalloway and so forth, but often they are presumed to, that's the unusual thing about them, that's the interesting thing about them. So now is it interesting about men that they should be indecisive? And why is it interesting? What kind of man is an interesting, indecisive man?
You're the philosopher.
Right. Let me abstract myself out of this one. I'm writing a book now from the perspective of a woman, and the biggest difference I sense in writing is that I feel a lot freer to make her flawed, to make her problematic in ways that I've noticed that I'm a little bit, the male characters that I've written, I'm a little bit hesitant to have them be anything other than innocent and thoughtful and sweet young men, which is not so interesting. Kind of as the subtext of your question makes clear. With respect to interest, I thought about this also. But why am I choosing? Why would one choose a kind of boring or somewhat removed or somewhat stodgy or stiff male character, and where does, if any, the interest in exploring such a character come from? But I really can't say for other people, because I still have the pleasure of at least believing that I write for myself, and so such a character for me was interesting simply because he was close to my sensibility, and I'm interested in exploring I guess aspects of my sensibility, because I still think of my writing as something that allows me to work out tensions or contradictions in myself. But I think, I don't know, for the reader, certainly it was probably a less interesting decision that I might have made. What about you?
Well, there's a tradition that goes from the 19th century, from something like Mansfield Park, from the figure of Fanny Price in Jane Austen, who's not like her other heroines, who's in the shadows, who no one notices, who emerges in the novel very strongly, partly because of her silences and partly because no one else rates her, and you begin to see the depth of her feeling. This happens also in something like say Washington Square, the figure of Catherine Sloper in Henry James. So I found myself, when I was writing, say, the novel Brooklyn, where really the woman isn't decisive, and she really gets pushed into everywhere. She's someone everybody likes, but she doesn't ever make a decision. That I was using that particular tradition of where a woman in the shadows can emerge strongly if the author just concentrates enough on the inner life, the sense of the sort of deep levels of conscience and consciousness. So it comes in many guises, because I would find it much harder to work with a much stronger figure, such as the other Jane Austen people, or even like someone like Dorothea in Middlemarch. I would have trouble with that, just because Dorothy is too decisive.
I was curious about both of you as writers living a long way away from where you started, and how that experience or perspective or view impacts, for example, The Passage North. Is that a novel that would have been different had you been still in Sri Lanka? And what does that longer view, gaze, how does that impact the work? And I think about Mann also, who ended up a long way from the conflict where he began, and how that impacted his work. As a writer who lives a long way from where I come from, I'm always interested in how that changes perspective.
It's something it's a really good question. It's something I've thought a lot about, because I have been away from Sri Lanka for maybe 12 or 13 years now. And I think when you're away, there's a sense of everydayness that you lose. There's a sense of kind of a casual relationship to the places that you live in. When I grew up in Sri Lanka, there would be in Colombo, there would be, every month or couple of months there'd be a bomb in the city. School would be cancelled. We'd go back home. Roads would be closed or whatever. But these were very quickly assimilated into ordinary life, right? I mean, they very quickly we stop responding to such things with shock. They become part of life. And in a way, my sense, and I mean, maybe I'm biased, but my sense is that people who continue to live in a place become accustomed to what happens there, and in not everybody, obviously, I'm talking in generalities, but in many senses, I've noticed people can cease to see what is profound or significant about a situation simply because they live there. I mean, I can make it a little bit more concrete. I mean, with respect to Sri Lanka, during the end of the war, there's this many people died, and there was this question about whether there was in fact a genocide that took place, and many people who live in Sri Lanka would say, no, there isn't. These people, you people abroad, most of the Tamils who live abroad have had to flee the country, and so that's why they make these claims from abroad, most of y'all don't know what the ground situation is like. Y'all don't know what things are really like here. If you look here, you go to a shop, people deal with each other from different races. People are friendly to each other. Like, but there's also a sense in which, like, for somebody who lives abroad, say something, if you hear about or if you follow an event of this kind of magnitude, or this kind of horror, or this kind of violence, it can never be removed from your conception of that place. If you don't have a daily relationship to a place, where your relationship to people and to places is habitual, is to say unthought, unthinking to some degree, then you cannot help but associate this place as the site of a great violence. And no matter how many times you go and come, no matter how many times you hear about how people are living there, this always becomes, I mean, this is kind of the, like, Goethe would never, was it Buchenwald? Like, yeah, that this will always be Buchenwald. It will never be any longer the site of Goethe's fantasies. And so for me, there's a sense in which if you're outside the day to day, or the daily, you have a clearer vision of certain things that tend to get obscured by the passage of time. For me, I will never forget it, but I think part of that has to do with the fact that I don't live there.
I mean, I think in the case of Thomas Mann, it was a question of loss, that he lost Lübeck. That his father's will said that family business was to be wound up, and they had been there for generations as ship owners, as warehouse owners, and as people in the as a center of commercial life in Lübeck. And the family moved to Munich, which was very far away in many ways. And so he moved from being a little prince in the street to being nobody, and that gave him the energy to write Buddenbrooks, to recreate the entire world going back generations. And he did that the second time when he lost Germany. And he lost its culture, so he wrote Dr. Faustus in California. And there's an intensity in both books that arise from the fact that the world describing had crumbled, and that almost he alone, certainly with Buddenbrooks, knew things that no one else would ever know. And if he didn't write them down, they would be lost forever. And there was a need to get these things down. So it wasn't just being away. It was the fact of loss, I think, was an important element in that. Yes, there's a hand up down there.
Hi. I was just thinking about the role of war in both your work. And there's a recent article in the Irish Times. I don't know what Colm thinks about the Irish writer and journalist Fintan O'Toole, but he wrote that the war in Ukraine is really a reenactment of the Second World War with real bullets, and that Brexit also is a kind of has a significant relationship to the Second World War. And then I see the role of the war, the troubles in Northern Ireland, of the war in Sri Lanka in Anuk's work. And I wonder, is a major issue here that our civilizations just really struggle to get over the primordial horror of war? I mean, Anuk mentioned the Iliad. It's a formative work, obviously, and it just recurs again and again and again that we seem to really, really struggle to process it. And is that, I don't know, is that something that's really running through Thomas Mann and your characters in A Passage North and so on?
The Good Friday Agreement, which eventually it really is a sort of preliminary settlement in Northern Ireland, which has been very successful to a large extent. It needs to be reformed, but of course it would. It hinges on two words, and they're two very beautiful words, because it just says that anyone in Northern Ireland can have an Irish identity, a British identity, or both. And or both is such a relief to have or both. You go, someone late at night, a diplomat in a room, like working like a poet. So I need just two words. They don't want territory. They're not fighting over farms. they don't want, they just want to put, if you could get a piece of words, or both. And so, or both did one thing. The other one is that Thomas Mann's speeches during the Second World War in America, he would get as many as 5,000 people in places like Oklahoma to come and hear him. It was called The Coming Victory of Democracy. And he was talking about the future. And he was close enough to Roosevelt to have his blessing for these speeches. And he was, essentially, when you read paragraphs of them, he's talking about the building of a new democracy in Germany. And we have to look sometimes in the awfulness that's going on. There are moments, when things worked, when the rebuilding of Germany after the war and the creation of what has been, in its own way, a sort of model democracy. I mean, we all have problems with it because it's just too rich, but it's a model democracy. And the Good Friday Agreement also. So, things fall apart, and then oddly enough, every so often, I mean, I hesitate to quote because people quote it too much, but Seamus Heaney, in that play, the version of the Philoctetes play he wrote, that hope in there's a moment comes when hope and history rhyme, and so it's just we always have to concentrate on the possibility of an agreement being made at some point or other in the future, sometimes the far future, but nonetheless. And I think Ireland and Germany are pretty good examples of that.
Yeah, so small comment first, but I know we were talking about what makes a removed character interesting, and what's the point of telling that kind of story. And I was just thinking about how a lot of diasporic kids, second generation immigrant children in other countries, we aren't we don't hear about, or we aren't present during colonization or even during struggles for liberation. And so we also feel that sense of obsession with learning more about the sort of violence that our people went through, regardless of the many different oppressors that have existed throughout time. And so in terms of what population that your book speaks to, I think a lot of diasporic kids, or when I read the book, I definitely felt that I definitely related to that sense of obsession, because I'm sure all of us have had that one class where a teacher was saying, oh, maybe colonization wasn't so bad, and then you get obsessed with one detail where you're no, actually the infrastructure development of India by the British was something that was extremely exploitative in exactly every single manner, and you can't tell me otherwise, which I think also leads into my next question about whether, so in the book you talk about this desperation of people trying to bring attention to this genocide and to this war, especially Tamil people abroad. And I wanted to ask whether this book was your attempt at bringing that obsession, or that manifesting that as something for people to read and know more about this history that is ignored, or and I guess what there's you talk about it in the book, and so how do you relate to that?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'll just start off by saying that I mean, this book, or both of these books were my response to what happened in the war in Sri Lanka. But I mean, I personally don't view anything I write as having any kind of political significance, really. For me, it's over. I mean, these people died, and they won't come back, and their bereaved relatives won't be unbereaved. And the knowledge of, the awareness of middle-class people in other countries doesn't change that, and it's of no interest to me, really. I'm in general, because of the kinds of people who have access, who have time to literature, I'm skeptical that it's really, at least for the political causes I care about, something that has power or significance. It's something I am personally. It's just my way of processing what I want to or need to process. But I will say also in response to something you said in your comments that part of not being part of this situation or part of being forced into the position of witness is this sense of lacking agency. We all know what it's like when someone you love is ill or is in a hospital bed, and it's up to, say, doctors and nurses to deal with the situation. There's this strong sense that there is nothing you can do short of maybe trying to imagine what this person is going through. You cannot minister to the person even, and in that sense, this character lacking agency. I mean, this relates to your question also about an uninteresting man or a man who cannot act. This lack of agency for me was, it was a very important part of what it means to be forced into a position of witness.
I think that's a good phrase to end, being forced into a position of witness. Maybe that's what a novel is. Thank you very much, and thank you very much everyone for coming. Thank you. Are you going to sign books?